The room has gone quiet around you. Whatever the day held, the noise, the obligations, the moments you replayed on the way home, all of it has stilled. And here you are, lying in the dark, with the weight of your own body pressing gently into the mattress, and somewhere beneath the tiredness, something that is still awake. You know this feeling. The day ends, and something in you does not quite end with it. The world has its off switch. You have never found yours. This is not a flaw. Viktor Frankl, Austrian psychiatrist, Auschwitz survivor, author of Man's Search for Meaning, spent his life studying people who felt life more deeply than the world seemed designed to handle. He noticed something early, long before the camps, long before the war. The people who suffered most acutely were often the same people who loved most completely. The capacity for one was the capacity for the other. You could not separate them. Tonight we follow that thread. 24 chapters, 3 hours. We begin in Vienna in the early 1930s, in a young doctor's office where something unusual was happening. Patients were coming to Frankl not with the classic complaints of neurosis, but with a different kind of pain entirely. They were not anxious in the ordinary sense. They were not depressed in the clinical sense. They were suffering from something the textbooks had not yet named. They were suffering from the weight of feeling too much in a world moving too fast to notice. Let your shoulders drop. Feel where your body makes contact with what is beneath you. The mattress, the pillow, the sheet. Let gravity do its work. You do not need to hold yourself up right now. Frankl had studied under Alfred Adler and had read Sigmund Freud carefully. He respected both. But he had noticed something neither man had quite named, that human beings are not merely driven by pleasure or by power. They are driven by the search for meaning. And sensitive people, people whose nervous systems register the world in greater detail, people who cry at music or carry the weight of other people's feelings home with them, who cannot watch suffering without feeling it themselves, these people are not malfunctioning. They are searching harder. They feel the absence of meaning more acutely, because they were made to feel everything more acutely. In 1930, Frankl was running a youth counseling center in Vienna. He was young, in his mid-20s, and already noticing that a significant portion of the young people coming to him were not sick in any traditional sense. They were overwhelmed, not by chaos, but by depth, by the size of the questions they carried, by the gap between the life they could feel was possible and the life they were actually living. Elaine Aron, an American psychologist who published her landmark work, The Highly Sensitive Person, in 1996, would later describe this in neurological terms. Approximately 15 to 20% of the population are born with a nervous system that processes sensation more deeply, more completely. They notice the flicker of a light others miss. They feel the friction in a room before anyone has spoken. They absorb, they carry home what others leave behind. But Frankl understood it first, in spirit, if not in scientific language. He knew that sensitivity was not a symptom, it was an orientation. Let your jaw soften. There is a word Frankl used, a word he reserved for a very specific kind of suffering, a kind that has nothing to do with trauma in the ordinary sense, and everything to do with what happens when a person of deep feeling cannot locate the thing their feeling is for. We will get there. It will be named, but not yet. For now, the feeling itself, the simple fact of it. You are lying in the dark at the end of a day, and something in you is still listening, still reaching, still trying to make sense of what it means to have moved through another day of your life and arrived here at this particular moment with this particular quiet in your chest. That is not a problem to solve. That is what it feels like to be the kind of person who notices. Frankl wrote that the tension between what we are and what we could become is not something to be eliminated. It is the prerequisite of mental health, not the enemy of peace, but its condition. The animal who has no unrealized potential is not at peace. It is simply finished. The human being who feels the distance between here and somewhere else, who lies awake with the gap alive in their chest, that person is not broken. That person is still reaching. There is something else worth saying at the start of tonight. Frankl wrote in many places about what he called the existential vacuum, a particular kind of inner emptiness that he began observing with increasing frequency in the years after the Second World War. Not the emptiness of poverty or loss or social deprivation, though those were real. The emptiness of abundance, of the person who has everything they were told they needed and still finds themselves lying awake in the dark with something unnamed pressing against the inside of their chest. He believed this vacuum was spreading, that modernity had solved many of the material problems and left intact the spiritual ones. That the traditions, which had once provided a ready-made answer to the question of meaning, the religion, the inherited role, the community with its clear expectations had weakened, and that in their absence, a person was left more free and more alone with the question than any previous generation had been. The sensitive person feels this vacuum most acutely because they are most awake to the question. But they are also, for that same reason, most capable of finding the answer. Let us go slowly. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. You do not need to fix the reaching. You do not need to close the gap tonight. You do not need to become something other than what you are in this room, in this moment, in this particular dark. Tonight is for resting inside the depth of what you feel. Let us begin. Chapter 2. Why sensitivity hurts. There is a woman, let us call her Elena, who has cried at things her whole life that others did not seem to notice. She wept at a stranger's funeral. She passed by chance on a Tuesday afternoon. She wept at a piece of music she heard through an open window, not knowing what it was or who was playing it. She wept at the kindness of a grocery clerk who handed her a bag with both hands, like something precious. She spent years apologizing for her tears, years calling it weakness, years watching other people move through the world without this weight and wondering what was wrong with her. Nothing was wrong with her. Elena was operating with what Elaine Aron described as a heightened depth of processing. Her brain was doing more work with each experience than the average nervous system is asked to do, more comparison, more reflection, more integration of what was happening now with everything that had happened before. The grocery clerk, handing her the bag with both hands, did not just register as a kind gesture. It registered as a contrast against every time she had been handled carelessly, against every moment she had wished someone would hold something gently. This is the mechanism beneath the tears, not weakness, a fuller registration of what is actually there. Viktor Frankl understood this in his own framework. He wrote in The Doctor and the Soul, a work less widely read than Man's Search for Meaning, but in many ways more intimate, that suffering is always personal. It cannot be aggregated or averaged. The same event lands differently in different people because different people bring different depths of inner life to bear on it. The depth is not a malfunction. It is simply the measure of how much you are paying attention. But paying more attention means more exposure, more surface area for the world to touch. Notice your breath right now, not to change it, only to feel it. Frankl was 37 years old when he was deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1942. He had spent over a decade by then observing the psychology of suffering, first as a young psychiatrist, then as a clinician developing what he would call logotherapy, the healing through meaning. When he entered the camps, he brought something most of his fellow prisoners did not have: a framework for what was happening. What he observed there confirmed what his years in the clinic had begun to show him. The prisoners who deteriorated most rapidly were often not the physically weakest. They were sometimes the most sensitive, the ones who had built their sense of self on interior richness, on art, on ideas, on feeling, found themselves in an environment that had stripped all of that away. The gap between who they were inside and the conditions they were forced to inhabit was a kind of agony that had no name in the medical texts. But they were also these same sensitive prisoners, sometimes the ones who survived inwardly, who maintained something no one could take from them. Frankl noticed that a significant number of the intellectuals and artists in the camps experienced something he found remarkable. They seemed to suffer more acutely than others in some respects, and yet they seemed to have access to a resource others did not. They could retreat briefly into memory, into imagination, into beauty that existed only inside them. He described watching exhausted men stand in the Bavarian countryside at dawn and notice the mountains rising in the distance, and something in their face changed. Not hope exactly, something quieter, recognition. The sensitive person's wound is also their door. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who wrote The Principles of Psychology in 1890, had described what he called a nervous temperament. People of finer organization, higher reactivity, richer inner life, and had written frankly that such people paid a higher price for their gifts. The price was not just feeling more deeply in moments of joy or beauty. It was feeling more deeply in moments of fear, of helplessness, of loss. Frankl would have agreed. He did not pretend that sensitivity was without cost. He was too honest for that. The wound is real. The tears are real. The exhaustion of registering more than others do, that is real. But he would have added, the wound does not define what you do with it. Let the weight of your body settle. Elena, who cried at funerals she passed by chance, eventually stopped apologizing. She did not stop crying, she stopped apologizing. She began to understand that what was moving through her when she wept was not weakness spilling out, but attention pouring in. She was present to something, more present than most people around her. The grief of a stranger was real, and she registered it. And that registration was not a liability. There is a practical consequence of what Aaron's research shows and what Frankl's observations confirm. The sensitive person's nervous system is doing more work than the average nervous system at all times. It is processing more, drawing more connections, holding more in awareness simultaneously. This is not inefficiency, it is a different specification. An instrument built for finer resolution requires more energy to operate. The exhaustion the sensitive person feels by the end of a social day, the need for solitude that is sometimes mistaken for antisocial tendency, is not preference, it is maintenance. The instrument needs quiet to reset. Frankl understood this need for solitude not as a deficiency, but as a resource. The sensitive person who retreats to quiet is not hiding from the world. They are recharging the capacity to meet it fully. The bed you are in right now is that quiet. The dark is doing its work. It was a form of witness. Frankl called this, in a phrase he would use across many of his works, the defiant power of the human spirit. Not defiance in the aggressive sense. Defiance in the sense of the self that remains when everything else has been taken. The capacity to feel deeply is part of that self. It does not disappear under pressure. In fact, under certain kinds of pressure, it becomes the only thing left. And that is enough to rest on tonight. Chapter 3, The Burden of Meaning. In the 1660s, in a cold room in Port Royal, south of Paris, Blaise Pascal, mathematician, physicist, theologian, sat alone and wrote. He was chronically ill. He had been offered every distraction the 17th century could provide. He refused most of them. He sat with his thoughts, and what came out was not comfort. It was a diagnosis of the human condition so precise that we are still reading it 360 years later. Pascal wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." He did not mean laziness. He meant that most people, when they are alone with their own inner life, encounter something they cannot face without help. The weight of it, the scale of the questions. The silence that asks for an answer they do not yet have. Viktor Frankl would have understood Pascal immediately. Frankl's patients, the young men and women who came to his counseling center in Vienna in the early 1930s, the adults who came to his clinic later, many of them described exactly this. Not anxiety about something specific, not fear of failure or loss or social rejection in the ordinary sense, something more fundamental, a weight. a sense that life was asking something of them that they had not yet been able to name, let alone answer. Frankl gave this a name eventually, but tonight we approach that name slowly, the way you approach a fire in a cold room, gradually, from a distance, letting the warmth reach you before you arrive. Let your jaw soften. The burden of meaning is not a problem the world has created. It is a problem, if problem is even the right word, that comes with being a certain kind of person. Someone for whom the question why has always felt more urgent than the question what. Someone for whom the fact of their own existence has never felt like a settled matter, but rather like a question they are still in the middle of answering. There is a kind of loneliness that is not loneliness at all. Frankl knew it. It has a different texture than the ordinary loneliness of being without company. You can be in a room full of people and feel it. You can be in the middle of a conversation and feel it. It does not go away when someone holds your hand. It is the loneliness of a person who senses that something is being asked of them by life itself and does not yet know how to respond. We will name that too before tonight is finished. Consider Thomas, a professor of literature who taught at a university in the north of England for 31 years. He loved his students. He loved the texts. He loved the particular smell of old books in the library basement, the weight of a hardcover, the moment when a student's face changed because an idea had reached them. He was good at his work. When he retired at 67, he did exactly what he had planned. He traveled, he gardened, he had more time for his grandchildren. 6 months in, he could not explain why he felt so lost. His wife was well, his health was reasonable, the grandchildren were wonderful. There was nothing missing in the inventory of a good life. And yet, Thomas came to understand, slowly, that what he had lost was not the work itself. It was the sense that the work was responding to something, that he was answering something, that his days were organized around a call he could hear, even when he could not see where it was coming from. Retirement had silenced the call, and the silence felt not like rest, but like a kind of deafness he had not expected. Frankl described this in clinical terms. He observed that human beings do not simply need stimulation or pleasure or even connection, though they need all of those. They need what he called meaning responsiveness, the felt sense that what they are doing matters, that it is addressed to something, that it is completing a sentence someone or something has begun. Remove that, and a person can have every material comfort and still feel a weight in the chest that no diagnosis quite covers. Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, writing in Copenhagen in the 1840s, described the same territory from a different angle. He wrote that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. The sensitive person, by virtue of their depth, is more aware of their freedom than most people are, more aware that they are choosing, that they could choose otherwise, that the shape of their life is not inevitable but chosen, and that choosing, really choosing, with full awareness of the alternatives, is vertiginous. The burden of meaning is not weakness. It is the weight of taking your own life seriously. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The burden of meaning, carried over many years, shapes the body. Frankl observed this in his patience. The person who has been carrying the weight of unanswered questions for a long time, who has been asking what their life is for without finding an answer that satisfies, carries that weight physically, in the held breath, in the elevated shoulders, in the jaw that does not quite release, in the sleep that does not quite restore. Thomas, the professor who found retirement unexpectedly empty, described it as a heaviness in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite dread. Something between them, a pressure without a clear object. Frankl would have recognized it. He had named it, in a sense, before Thomas arrived at the clinical vocabulary. It is the body's response to a meaning that has not yet been found. The physical representation of a question still open. The treatment is not the removal of the question. The question is part of what makes Thomas fully human. The treatment is the gradual finding of what the question is pointing toward. The small, particular meaning available in this day, this room, this relationship, this work. The body follows. When the meaning arrives, even partially, even provisionally, the held breath releases. The shoulders drop. Not because the question is answered, because the reaching has found a direction. Feel your shoulders right now. Let them drop a little. Frankl never pretended that this burden could be set down permanently. He did not offer relief in that sense. What he offered was something more durable, the understanding that the burden itself is the signal, that the weight in your chest when you lie in the dark, the sense that something is being asked of you, that is not illness. That is the human spirit reaching toward its own potential. He wrote that meaning cannot be given, it can only be found. And finding it requires a kind of inner listening that most of the world does not reward and many people never learn. But you are listening right now. And that is not nothing. Chapter 4, Anxiety and Inner Depth. Somewhere in Frankl's writings, not in Man's Search for Meaning, which is the book everyone reads, but in the quieter, more clinical volumes he produced across his long career, he describes a moment, not a moment in the concentration camps, not a moment of extremity or crisis, a moment in an ordinary room, a small moment, almost domestic in its scale, that he returned to in his mind over many years because of what it showed him about the nature of feeling and the nature of meaning and the strange geometry of suffering. We will arrive at that moment before tonight is done. For now, anxiety. Frankl trained as a psychiatrist in the tradition of Freud and Adler, but he diverged from both in a fundamental way. He believed that much of what the 20th century was diagnosing as neurosis, anxiety, depression, existential unrest, was not always a pathology, not always a disorder. Sometimes it was a signal. Sometimes the anxious person was not sick. They were sensitive, and their sensitivity had detected something that needed detection. He called this the neugenic dimension, from the Greek nous, meaning mind or spirit. Not all psychological suffering, Frankl argued, originates in the psyche in the classical sense. Some of it originates in the spirit's encounter with questions the spirit cannot avoid. What does my life mean? What am I here to do? Am I living in accord with what I most deeply value? These are not questions a tranquilizer answers. They are not questions a better sleep schedule answers. They are questions that require engagement, not suppression. Søren Kierkegaard had understood this a century before Frankl. Writing in The Concept of Anxiety in 1844 in Copenhagen at the age of 31, he described anxiety not as a response to a specific threat, that he called fear, but as a response to freedom itself, to the vast openness of all the choices not yet made, all the selves not yet inhabited, all the futures branching away from this present moment. The sensitive person, Kierkegaard understood, is more awake to this openness than others. The very same depth that allows them to feel music in their chest and carry strangers' grief also allows them to perceive, more vividly than most, the contingency of their own existence. The fact that things could be otherwise. The fact that they are choosing every single day. That is vertiginous. Let your breath move at its own pace. Rollo May, American existential psychologist, student of both Adler and the European existentialists, author of The Courage to Create in 1975, wrote that anxiety is the experience of the threat of non-being. Not literal death, though death is the ultimate form. Any threat to what we most deeply are, our values, our sense of meaning, our connection to those we love, produces something that feels like the ground giving way beneath us. Sensitive people feel this more, not because they are constitutionally fragile, but because they are constitutionally invested. They have given more of themselves to things. They have built their inner life out of richer materials. When those materials are threatened, when the meaning seems to drain away, when the connection frays, when the values they have organized their life around begin to feel uncertain, the loss is proportionally greater. This is not dramatic, it is arithmetic. In 1930, a young woman came to Frankl's counseling center in Vienna. She was in her early 20s. By all external measures, her life was fine. She had work, she had a small apartment, she had friends who liked her. But she described to Frankl a persistent sense that nothing was quite real, that she moved through the day behind glass, that she participated in conversations without inhabiting them, that somewhere, at some distance from the life she was living, there was a life that was actually hers, and she could feel its outline without being able to find the door. Frankl did not diagnose her with dissociation, though that vocabulary was available to him. He understood her complaint as existential before it was clinical. She was not disconnected from reality. She was disconnected from meaning. She was living a life that had not yet found its address. He worked with her over many months, not to reduce her sensitivity, but to give it a direction. Notice the silence in the room around you. The important thing Frankl understood, the thing that separates his framework from simpler ones, is that anxiety and depth are not accidentally related. They are structurally related. The person who does not feel much does not worry much. The person who feels a great deal has a great deal to worry about, not because they have invented problems, but because they are paying attention to real ones. The work is not to eliminate the anxiety. The work is to understand what the anxiety is pointing toward. To ask, what does this feeling know that my thinking does not yet know? What is it protecting? What is it calling me toward? Anxiety, in this reading, is not the enemy of peace. It is the guide, waiting at the edge of the path, asking you to look more carefully at where you are going. Let your eyes close a little more. There is a specific form of anxiety that Frankl observed in his most sensitive patients, that he called existential anxiety. The anxiety that is not about a specific threat, but about the openness of existence itself. The anxiety of being free. It arrives most often at transitions. At the moments when one chapter ends and the next has not yet begun. At retirement. At the end of a long relationship. At the completion of a project that gave life its shape for years. In these gaps, the questions that the structure was holding at bay become audible again. What do I actually want? What am I actually for? Who am I when the role is not organizing me? The sensitive person encounters these questions more often and more acutely than others, because they are more conscious of the contingency of their arrangements, more aware that the structure could be otherwise, more alert to the gap between the life they are living and the life they most deeply want. This awareness is uncomfortable. It is also the beginning of every real change. The anxiety at the transition is not the enemy of what comes next. It is the space in which what comes next becomes possible. Kierkegaard understood that the leap, the moment of genuine commitment to the next thing, cannot be taken without first passing through the vertigo of the gap. The dizziness of freedom is not a malfunction. It is the experience of being at the edge of something real. The room is still here. You are still here. Whatever the anxiety has been trying to tell you today, it will still be there tomorrow. You do not have to answer it tonight. Tonight, you can simply know that it is a signal, not a sentence. Evidence of depth, not evidence of failure. Frankl believed that the most well-adjusted people he ever met were not the people who had learned to feel less. They were the people who had learned to do something with what they felt. That distinction matters. Chapter 5. Frankl's Quiet Psychology. There is a particular kind of therapy session that Viktor Frankl described in several of his books. One that did not look much like therapy at all. The patient would arrive. They would sit. They would begin to describe the problem. And Frankl would listen, not with the pointed interpretive attention of a psychoanalyst looking for the hidden meaning beneath the surface, but with a different quality of attention, receptive, patient. He would listen as if he were a large room that the patient's words could move around in, without being redirected or corrected or decoded. Then he would ask, usually, only one question. Something like, what does this ask of you? Not, what does this mean? Not, where does this come from? Not even, how does this make you feel? But, what does this ask of you? The shift was subtle, but it moved the entire weight of the conversation from the patient as subject being examined to the patient as agent being addressed, from illness to invitation, from something being done to a person to something being asked of a person. This is the quiet revolution inside Frankl's psychology. Rollo May, writing in Love and Will in 1969, described Frankl's logotherapy as the necessary correction to a century of psychologies that had reduced the human being to a mechanism. Freud's mechanism was libido, the hydraulics of desire. Adler's was the will to power, the striving for superiority. Both frameworks were illuminating. Both had real explanatory force, and both, May argued, were insufficient for the person lying awake at 3 a.m, not because their desires were frustrated or their status was threatened, but because they could not find a reason to get up in the morning. Frankl's framework addressed that person. Let your shoulders drop. He called his therapy logotherapy, from logos, the Greek word for meaning. Not word, as it is sometimes translated, but meaning. The word that is addressed to someone. The meaning that is not abstract but personal. Not the meaning of life in general, but the meaning of your life in this moment, given what you are carrying and what you are capable of and what the world right now is asking of you. Frankl was insistent on something that sounds simple but is not. Meaning cannot be given, it can only be found. And it can only be found by the person who needs it. The therapist, the friend, the book, the philosophical tradition can only create the conditions in which finding becomes possible, can only clear some of the debris, can only point toward the territory. The finding is always yours. This matters especially for the sensitive person, because the sensitive person has often spent years receiving other people's meanings, other people's frameworks for what a good life looks like, what success requires, what love should feel like, what grief is supposed to last. They have taken on these meanings the way they take on everything, deeply, completely, as if it were their own. And somewhere beneath the stack of inherited meanings, there is a meaning that actually is their own, quieter and less dramatic, not a philosophy but a felt sense of what matters, what calls to them, what makes the day feel real. Frankl's quiet psychology is the practice of finding that. William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist who taught at Harvard at the turn of the 20th century, had written in 1890 that the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. But James was careful. He did not mean appreciated by others, though that matters. He meant appreciated by oneself. The sense that what you feel is real, that what you notice is real, that your inner life has weight and worth. The sensitive person often does not believe this. They have been told, not cruelly but persistently, that they feel too much, react too strongly, take things too personally, that the volume of their inner life is a social liability. And many of them have spent decades trying to turn the volume down, trying to be easier to be around, trying to feel less so that other people feel less overwhelmed by them. Frankl would have said, this is the wrong direction entirely. Feel where your body is heaviest right now. The sensitive person's task is not to feel less. It is to find worthy objects for what they feel, to direct the extraordinary capacity for depth and response and care towards something that can use it. toward work that asks something of them, toward relationships that can hold the weight, toward a life organized around what they most deeply value rather than what requires the least of them. This is not grand. It is not heroic. It is, in Frankl's framework, simply the work. The quiet, ongoing dailiness of finding meaning in the materials of your particular life. He believed that 3 pathways into meaning were available to every person, regardless of their circumstances. The first, what we give to the world, our work, our creations, our deeds. The second, what we receive from the world, beauty, love, truth encountered. The third, and this is the one that mattered most in the camps, the one that has no external requirement, the attitude we choose toward unavoidable suffering. There is a question Frankl asked patients that is worth asking yourself tonight. Not as a project, not as something to work out before you sleep, simply as a question to hold gently in the dark, the way you might hold a stone in your hand without pressing it. The question is, what does this moment ask of me? Not this year, not this life, not the grand trajectory, this moment, tonight, lying here with what you are carrying and what you have survived and what you still hope for. What does it ask? For most people, on most nights, the answer is something very simple. Rest. You are allowed to rest. The asking does not stop. The calling does not stop. But the calling at this hour is the quiet one, the one that does not require action, the one that requires only presence. You are present. That is enough. The third pathway is the one the sensitive person knows best, even if they have never named it. They have always been finding meaning in the middle of difficulty. They have always been choosing how to hold what they feel. The work has not been wasted. Chapter 6, Suffering Without Bitterness. Richard was 53 years old when his mother died, and he was surprised by the grief. They had not been particularly close in the years before her death. The relationship had been complicated, not badly damaged, not estranged, but layered with things unsaid, with years of parallel lives that had drifted apart, with the particular ambivalence of a son who loved his mother and found her difficult and had never quite reconciled those two facts. When she died, he expected something manageable, a sadness appropriate to the circumstances, a loss that he could organize into weeks and months, attend to, and then set down. What arrived instead was enormous, disproportionate, he thought at first. He cried in his car. He found himself standing in supermarket aisles with no memory of why he had come. He dreamed about her every night for 3 months. Not sad dreams, just ordinary ones. The two of them doing unremarkable things. And then he would wake and remember, and the remembering was the loss all over again. He began to feel guilty about the size of his grief, felt that it was somehow unfair, that he was grieving the version of the relationship they might have had, not the one they did have, that he was appropriating a loss that belonged to people who had been closer to her, that his grief was a kind of fiction. Viktor Frankl would have recognized this immediately. He had written about it, this particular confusion, the grief that does not feel proportionate, that arrives with a dimension that seems to exceed the circumstances. He understood that what Richard was grieving was not just his mother. He was grieving the door that had finally, permanently closed on a possibility. The conversation they had never quite had. The version of the relationship that had been postponed and was now foreclosed. That is a real loss. Let your jaw soften. Frankl was precise about suffering. He did not romanticize it. He did not say it was secretly good, or that it always produced wisdom, or that it was necessary for growth. He said something more careful, that suffering is unavoidable, and that the only question, the only freedom that cannot be taken, is the attitude you bring to it. He wrote this not as an abstraction, but as a lived fact. He had been in Auschwitz and Dachau. He had lost his wife, his parents, his brother. He had watched people die who were younger and healthier and less guilty than him. He had no patience for the idea that suffering was secretly beneficial. He knew what it cost. What he also knew from the inside, not from the outside, is that two people can undergo the same loss and come out of it differently. Not because one was stronger or more resilient in some genetic sense, but because one had found somewhere in the loss something to hold on to. A thread of meaning that did not explain the suffering or justify it, but simply made it possible to continue. Bitterness, Frankl understood, is what happens when suffering lands with no thread to hold. When the loss arrives, and the person looks for meaning and finds nothing, and concludes, understandably, rationally, that there is no meaning to be found, that the universe is indifferent, that their suffering is random and purposeless, and that all they can do is wait for it to pass. Bitterness is not weakness. It is a logical conclusion in the absence of meaning. William James, whose Principles of Psychology in 1890 had explored the relationship between emotion and attention, understood that what we attend to becomes the substance of our experience. The person who attends to the injustice of their loss, and the injustice may be entirely real, constructs an experience organized around that injustice. The person who can find, even within the loss, some small thread of what the loss reveals, what it meant to love, what it shows about what they valued, what it proves about the capacity for attachment. That person constructs a different experience. Not better, not easier, different. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Richard did not resolve his grief quickly. He did not resolve it at all, in the sense of finishing it. What he found over the following year was that the size of his grief was information. It told him something about the size of what had been possible between him and his mother, even if that possibility had never been fully realized. The grief was proportionate not to the relationship they had, but to the one he had always quietly wanted. That knowledge did not close the wound, but it gave the wound an address. It gave the suffering a meaning that was not a justification, not this was good or this was necessary, but simply this much grief means this much love, even unexpressed, even tangled with difficulty, even partial and imperfect and complicated. Seneca, writing his letters to Lucilius in the last years of his life, understood that grief arrives in waves and that the waves do not follow a predictable schedule. He had lost his son. He had lost friends whose deaths were unexpected. He had watched people he admired destroyed by the same emperor he served. He was writing his letters as a man under sentence of death he did not yet know had been issued. He wrote about grief without sentimentality. He described it as the tax on love. Real love, he said, produces real grief. The person who has not loved will not grieve, and the person who grieves fully, who does not hurry through it, or abbreviate it, or apologize for its size, that person has honored what they lost. Richard, who grieved his complicated mother more than he expected, was honoring something real. The grief was not disproportionate. The relationship was more complex than the grief made it look. But the love inside the complexity was real. And real love, when it meets an ending, takes time. Frankl understood this from his own loss. He did not rush through the grief for his wife, who died in Bergen-Belsen. He let it be what it was. And out of it came some of the most honest writing about love and loss that exists in the psychological literature. The grief is the form the love takes when the beloved is gone. It does not need to be managed, only inhabited. Frankl called this attitudinal value, the meaning we create by choosing how to relate to what we cannot change, not denying the pain, not performing serenity, simply finding the human response that dignifies rather than destroys the experience. Suffering without bitterness is not the absence of bitterness. It is the choice, made again and again, to look for the thread. Chapter 7, The Wound of Awareness. Carl Jung, Swiss psychiatrist, founder of analytical psychology, author of the Red Book, wrote in a letter in 1960, 1 year before his death, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." He was 84 years old when he wrote that. He had spent 60 years looking inside, his own inside, which was strange and rich and sometimes terrifying, and he had come to believe that the deepest work a human being can do is not the construction of an external life, though that has its importance, but the honest confrontation with what lives in the inner one. Jung had a name for what lives there in the dark, the shadow. Not evil, exactly, he was careful about that. The shadow is simply what we have refused to acknowledge about ourselves. The parts we judged unacceptable and pushed underground. The anger we decided was too dangerous. The grief we decided was too much. The desire we decided was inappropriate. Down it goes, into the basement of the psyche, and there it stays, not dead but alive, running things from below. The sensitive person, Jung observed, often has a particularly large shadow, not because they are more wicked, because they are more conscious. They have noticed more about themselves than the average person notices, and much of what they have noticed has felt unacceptable, too much, too intense, too raw, and so they have pushed more underground. The very depth of their awareness creates a proportionally deep shadow. Let your shoulders drop. Viktor Frankl and Carl Jung came at the human psyche from different angles. Frankl from the direction of meaning, Jung from the direction of the unconscious. But they converged on something similar. The idea that the inner life, confronted honestly, is not a source of pathology, but a source of strength. That the wound is not the opposite of health. That what we carry in the dark is not our worst feature, but often our most powerful one, waiting to be integrated rather than suppressed. Frankl had observed in the camps that the prisoners who maintained their inner dignity, who had not, despite everything, been stripped of their humanity, were often people who had done significant interior work before they arrived. Not therapeutic work necessarily, simply the work of living deliberately, of having paid attention to their own inner lives over years, of having developed what he called inner freedom, the capacity to choose one's attitude regardless of external circumstances. That inner freedom was not available to everyone. It had to have been built over time, quietly, in the ordinary rooms of ordinary lives before the crisis arrived. The wound of awareness is real. Knowing more than others do about what it means to feel, to lose, to be uncertain, this is not comfortable. It costs something. The sensitive person pays, daily, a small tax on their depth. Notice your breath right now. In 1913, in Zurich, Jung sat in his study and began to hear voices. He had just broken with Sigmund Freud, his mentor and father figure, and the rupture had left him in something like freefall. He was 48 years old. He was afraid, he later admitted, that what he was experiencing was the beginning of psychosis. That the voices, the visions, the interior figures who spoke to him in his study were evidence of madness rather than imagination. He did something extraordinary. Instead of diagnosing himself and suppressing the experience, he listened. He wrote down what the figures said. He illustrated the pages. He created, over the next 16 years, what became the Red Book, an illuminated manuscript he showed to almost no one, a record of one of the most intensive inner journeys a psychologist has ever documented. What he discovered, and this is the relevant part for tonight, is that the figures in the dark, the voices that seemed threatening, were not enemies. They were estranged parts of himself. The ones he had neglected, the ones he had called irrational and pushed aside in favor of the rigorous scientific thinking that had made him successful. When he welcomed them, when he listened to them, when he gave them room, they stopped being terrifying and became what they actually were: resources. The wound of awareness is the door to integration. For the sensitive person who lies awake with the weight of everything they have noticed, the grief they have carried for people they barely know, the anger they have pushed down because it seemed too large, the longing they have not permitted because it felt too exposed. Frankl and Jung point in the same direction. What Jung observed about his own shadow is worth sitting with here. He had been one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, trained in medicine, deeply read in philosophy and literature, possessed of an extraordinary capacity for systematic thought. He had built a theory of the psyche that was, in its ambition, comparable to anything in the Western intellectual tradition. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had accomplished a great deal. And yet, in 1913, alone in his Zurich study, what confronted him was not his achievement. It was what his achievement had required him to set aside. The feeling, the irrationality, the parts of himself that did not fit the brilliant rational thinker, the parts he had dismissed as inferior and sent underground. The shadow, Jung said, is always roughly equal in size to the persona. The more polished the public self, the larger the private inventory of what was sacrificed to polish it. The sensitive person who has learned to function by managing their depth, by presenting a calmer, more contained, more socially viable version of themselves, has a shadow roughly equal to the distance between who they are and who they have been presenting. That distance is real. The inventory is real. And it calls, not to be acted upon necessarily, to be seen, not away from the wound, toward it, not to suffer more, but to understand more fully what the wound is made of, because what it is made of, that is also what you are made of. And what you are made of, fully known, fully inhabited, is not your problem. It is your resource. Chapter 8, Emotional Pain and Dignity. Irvin Yalom, the American existential psychiatrist who has been treating patients in San Francisco since the 1960s and has written about those patients with a candor and warmth that is rare in clinical literature, once described a session that has stayed with him. He was working with a woman in her 60s, a retired teacher, a grandmother, who had come to him not in crisis, but in what she described as a long, low-grade sorrow, nothing acute, nothing that had a clear, precipitating event. Just a heaviness that had gathered over years and now sat on her chest like a second skin. She was, Yalom said, one of the most emotionally intelligent people he had ever worked with. She could describe her own inner states with extraordinary precision. She knew exactly which memory was attached to which feeling. She could trace the genealogy of her sadness back through decades with the accuracy of a historian. And yet she suffered. Yalom's insight, which he has described in Love's Executioner and The Gift of Therapy, is that emotional intelligence does not protect you from emotional pain. It may, in fact, intensify it. The person who feels clearly is the person who feels completely. There is no anesthetic in awareness. Awareness is simply fuller contact with what is there. What emotional intelligence provides is something different. Not relief from pain, but dignity in pain. The capacity to suffer without being destroyed by suffering. The capacity to feel the full weight of what is there and to maintain inside that weight a sense of yourself as someone more than what you are feeling. Let your jaw soften. Viktor Frankl understood dignity in pain as a clinical and philosophical reality. He had seen it stripped away. He had watched human beings in the most extreme circumstances descend into what he described carefully, without condemnation, as the behavior of trapped animals. People who had begun to live only by instinct, who had surrendered the inner life entirely because maintaining it cost more than they had left. But he had also, and this is what he held on to, across the years and across the books, he had also watched people in those same circumstances maintain something, a choice to remain human, a small, daily, ordinary insistence on dignity that had no practical reward and sometimes no witness. A man sharing the last of his bread with someone who had none. A woman comforting someone younger in the darkness of a barracks when she had nothing left to give from. These were not heroic acts in the dramatic sense. They were the ordinary texture of a certain kind of person. Someone who had decided before all of this, and perhaps in the middle of it, that how they treated others was a thing they still controlled. Emotional pain with dignity is not the suppression of pain, it is the insistence inside the pain that you are still a person who can choose. Feel the weight of your body against what is beneath you. Yalom's teacher, the woman in her 60s with the low-grade sorrow, eventually said something in a session that shifted everything. She said, "I think I have been treating my sadness as if it was shameful, as if feeling this much were evidence of something wrong with me." Yalom did not argue with her. He simply asked, "What if it is evidence of something right?" The question opened something. She began to describe what she had cared about across her life, the things that had made her feel alive, the students who had needed her, the daughter she had loved with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her, the garden, the novels she had read until 2 in the morning, the particular quality of winter light through her kitchen window on a Sunday morning. The sadness did not disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer a symptom, it was a history. It was the accumulated record of someone who had cared deeply, continuously, at real cost about the things that were worth caring about. The sorrow was the shadow of the love. Frankl wrote in a passage from Man's Search for Meaning that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward any given set of circumstances. Yalom spent a career asking his patients about the things they had avoided looking at directly. Not because avoidance is always wrong. Sometimes it is the only viable option for a period. But because what is avoided does not disappear, it accumulates. It finds expression in symptoms, in the body, in the shape of the life we construct around the thing we cannot quite face. The sensitive person avoids less than most. Their very sensitivity makes the denial harder to maintain. They feel the edges of what they are avoiding too acutely to pretend it is not there. But they sometimes avoid the expression of it, the saying of it, the bringing of it from the interior into relationship. Frankl believed that meaning finally is relational. that the meaning we find has to meet the world in some form, through work, through love, through the simple act of bearing witness. The interior meaning that never surfaces, that stays in the private journal or the folder of unsent emails, is not without value, but it is incomplete. Dignity, in the end, requires a witness. Even if the witness is only yourself, finally seen, this is not a consolation. It is an anatomy, a map of the only territory that cannot be conquered. The sensitive person who suffers carries this map even when they do not know they are holding it. They are already choosing constantly how to relate to what they feel. Every time they do not lash out when they could. Every time they weep and do not become the weeping. Every time they carry someone else's sorrow and still show up for their own life, they are exercising the freedom Frankl described. They are already practicing dignity. They may just not have been told that that is what it is. Chapter 9. When the world feels heavy. Helena was a nurse for 22 years. She worked in a teaching hospital in the Midlands, not the intensive care unit, though she had done a rotation there early in her career. She worked in oncology. She was good at it. She had the particular combination of clinical precision and human warmth that oncology demands. And she gave it unstintingly, year after year, to patients who needed it and families who were terrified and colleagues who were burning out around her. She did not burn out. Or rather, she burned out and then rebuilt herself, and burned out again and rebuilt herself again, many times over, in the way that certain people do. People who cannot quite stop giving, who find the work too meaningful to step back from even when it is costing them more than they have, who absorb the suffering of others so completely that they sometimes cannot find the boundary between what they are feeling and what they have absorbed. By the time she was in her late 40s, she was exhausted in a way she could not quite describe. She slept well, she ate well, she exercised. There was no clinical explanation for the heaviness. It was not depression in the classic sense. It was something more like saturation, like a cloth that has been absorbing liquid for so long that it can no longer absorb and can no longer release. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in Rome around 65 CE, in the letters to Lucilius that would become one of the most intimate documents of the ancient world, wrote about the body's capacity to carry more than it acknowledges. He wrote about the way exhaustion sneaks up on a person who is too engaged with living to notice that they are depleting. He was writing about himself, a man of vast responsibilities, vast wealth, and a private life organized around the attempt to remain philosophically honest inside impossible circumstances. He understood Helena's problem across 2,000 years. Let your breath move as it wants to move. Viktor Frankl named what Helena was experiencing. He called it compassion fatigue, though his language for it was more clinical. He understood that the capacity to feel what others feel, to be genuinely affected by another person's pain, rather than professionally handling it at arm's length, is both the healer's greatest gift and their greatest vulnerability. The healer who can truly feel what the patient is feeling can meet them in a place no textbook can reach. And the healer who can truly feel what the patient is feeling will, eventually be carrying weight that belongs to many people at once. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch-American psychiatrist who published The Body Keeps the Score in 2014, has written about what happens in the bodies of people who are chronically exposed to others' trauma and distress. The nervous system adapts. It begins to treat other people's suffering as a form of threat. The shoulders stay elevated, the breath stays shallow. The vigilance that is appropriate in a crisis becomes a permanent baseline. The world feels heavy because the body has learned to treat it as heavy. This is not weakness. It is the body's attempt to protect itself from what the spirit insists on continuing to do. Feel where your shoulders are right now. Let them drop. Helena did not stop nursing. She took a leave 3 months, which felt initially like failure. And in that leave, she found her way back to something she had not done since her 20s. She read novels. Not medical literature, not professional development, novels. She read for hours at a time, lying on her sofa, which she had not done since before her children were born. What she was doing, though she would not have described it this way, was relearning the difference between empathy and absorption. Empathy enters the room with someone, meets them where they are, feels the texture of their experience, and then, and this is the crucial part, comes back, steps back outside, returns to its own body, its own life, its own present moment. Absorption does not come back, it stays. Frankl wrote about what he called the existential vacuum, the sense of inner emptiness that descends when a person has been so fully in service of others, or of a role, or of a system, that they have lost track of their own center. The vacuum is not selfishness to correct. It is the signal that the self needs tending. Helena, on her sofa with her novels, was tending it. Seneca had an evening practice. At the end of each day, he reviewed what had happened. Not as judgment, he was explicit about this. Not to condemn himself for the failures of the day or to congratulate himself for the successes. Simply to notice, to account, to ask, how was this day spent? What did I give? What did I take? Who did I meet? And how did I meet them? Helena, the nurse who was saturated after 22 years of giving, might have benefited from a version of this practice. Not to judge the giving was real and good, but to notice at the end of each day what had been received, the small mercies, the patient who said thank you in a way that reached her, the colleague who made her laugh, the moment, brief, when she was fully present and felt it was enough. The accounting includes both columns, what went out and what came in. The sensitive person, who tends to be more aware of what they have given than what they have received, sometimes forgets the second column entirely. The second column is important. It is what makes the first column sustainable. When the world feels heavy, the answer is rarely to stop caring. The answer is to find, inside the caring, a path back to your own breath, your own body, your own present moment. The place from which you can continue to give without losing the giver. Frankl believed that this balance between self and service, between giving and receiving, between the world's needs and the individual's resources, was not a problem to be solved once and permanently. It was a practice, a daily recalibration, a returning. The world is heavy sometimes. That is true, and you are allowed to set it down for the night. Chapter 10, The Sensitive Conscience. There is a kind of guilt that has nothing to do with wrongdoing. Frankl described it. He called it existential guilt, the guilt that arises not from having done something wrong, but from having failed to fulfill a potential. The gap between what we are and what we sense we could be. The not yet lived parts of ourselves, the unloved people we could have loved better, the work we have postponed, the calls not made, the presents not given. This guilt does not accuse, it does not shout, it whispers, and it tends to whisper loudest in the dark, when the distractions have quieted and the only thing left is the interior. The sensitive person hears it louder than most, not because they have done worse, often because they have tried harder, because the standard they hold themselves to is not the legal standard or the social standard, but a deeper one, the standard of the conscience that Frankl believed was the voice of meaning, calling you toward what you are capable of. And the more capable you are, the higher the standard. And the higher the standard, the larger the gap. And the larger the gap, the louder the whisper. Let your jaw soften. John Bowlby, the British psychologist who developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 1960s, working from a small office in London, largely misunderstood by his colleagues for years, understood that the capacity for conscience develops in relationship. The child who is held securely, who has a consistent experience of being cared for and responded to, develops a sense of inner worth that allows for the toleration of guilt without self-destruction. They can hear the whisper of conscience without being undone by it. The child who is held inconsistently, who has learned that care is unpredictable or conditional, develops a different relationship with conscience. They tend to hear it not as a quiet guide, but as an accuser, not as information, but as verdict. Many sensitive people grew up with the second experience, not necessarily because they were badly treated, sometimes simply because their inner life was so vivid and their reactions so intense that even well-meaning caregivers did not quite know how to hold it. You're too sensitive. Don't cry. Stop making everything so big. These are not cruel statements. They are usually helpless ones. But they teach a child that the size of their inner life is a problem, that their conscience's voice is too loud, that they should turn down the volume before they speak. And many of them have been trying to turn down the volume ever since. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Viktor Frankl offered something important here, a distinction between neurotic guilt and existential guilt. Neurotic guilt is the guilt that loops back on itself, the accusation without direction, the shame that simply gathers and grows without pointing anywhere. Existential guilt is the guilt that calls, that says, here is what matters to you. Here is where you have fallen short. Here is what you could do differently. Neurotic guilt paralyzes. Existential guilt propels. The sensitive conscience, properly understood, is not an oppressor. It is a compass. The fact that you feel guilty about the phone call you did not make, about the presents you failed to give, about the opportunity to be kinder that passed while you were distracted. That guilt is not evidence that you are deficient. It is evidence that you know what matters to you. It is evidence of a compass that is working. The work is not to silence the compass. The work is to understand what it is pointing toward. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst who worked in London throughout the mid-20th century and developed his concept of the true self and false self, understood that many people come to adulthood with a self that has been, in his phrase, hidden for safekeeping. The true self, the self that feels and reaches and wants and grieves, has been tucked away behind the false self, which functions, which performs, which is acceptable to others. The sensitive conscience is often the voice of the hidden true self, calling, asking to be let out. It is not always comfortable to listen to it, but it is also not possible to silence it permanently. The whisper continues. Even tonight, the conscience, properly distinguished from the inner critic, is a guide rather than an accuser. Frankl described the conscience as the most deeply human faculty, the part of us that is oriented toward meaning, that feels the call of what matters, that registers the gap between what we are doing and what we most deeply value. He believed this faculty was prior to psychology, in some sense, that it operated at a level below mood, below personality, below the conditioned responses that ordinary therapy addressed. To hear the conscience, the real one, beneath the noise of the borrowed standards and the inner critic requires a particular quality of quiet, not the absence of thought, the absence of urgency, the willingness to sit with the whisper long enough to hear what it is actually saying. Tonight, in the dark, is one of the few times the day offers that quality of quiet. The conscience has been waiting for it. It will not shout. It never shouts. But if you are still, you will hear it. Let your body settle into the night. The conscience that keeps you awake, the one that reminds you of the person you mean to be, the call you keep meaning to make, the way you want to live inside your own life. That conscience is not your enemy. It is the most loyal thing you have. It has been holding the thread back to your own center across all the years you spent being other things for other people. Tonight, you can simply hear it. You do not have to answer it yet. Chapter 11. Meaning beyond mood. One of the things Viktor Frankl was most insistent about, and he was insistent in the gentle professor's way, the way that makes you think the insistence is your own conclusion, is this: meaning is not a feeling. This matters because the sensitive person, in particular, is often tempted to believe that meaning is something they will feel when everything is right, when the mood is good, when the grief has passed, when the relationship has healed, when the work is going well, when the weight in the chest has finally lifted. Frankl had been in Auschwitz. He knew about moods that do not lift. He knew that if meaning waited for the mood to be good, meaning would never arrive. He knew that the most important choices a person makes are often made on difficult days, in difficult circumstances, in the middle of moods that offer no assistance whatsoever. And he knew from the inside that meaning is available precisely there in the difficult day, in the unwilling body, in the dark room. Meaning is not a gift that comes from outside when conditions are right. It is a capacity that lives inside the person, and it can be exercised even, perhaps especially, when everything outside is wrong. Feel the weight of your body right now, the heaviness of your limbs against the mattress. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst who spent decades working with infants and their mothers at London hospitals in the 1940s and 1950s, developed the concept of what he called the holding environment. He described it as the function of early caregiving, not to make the infant feel perfect, but to create conditions stable enough that the infant can tolerate imperfection without being destroyed by it. The good enough mother, his phrase, does not give the child a flawless experience. She gives the child a survivable experience, one in which imperfection is real but not fatal. Frankl's conception of meaning is the adult version of this. The meaning that is available in the difficult day is not the meaning of perfection, it is the meaning of the good enough response. The choice made under pressure that is not the best choice imaginable, but is the best choice available. The kindness given when you are tired. The attention offered when your own needs are calling. The presence maintained when everything in you wants to withdraw. This is what meaning looks like from the inside, not a feeling of completion, a choice made anyway. John Bowlby. Writing about attachment in the late 1950s, in papers that his colleagues dismissed for a decade, before the rest of science caught up, described how securely attached people face difficulty differently from insecurely attached ones. The securely attached person can be in distress without becoming the distress. They can feel the full weight of a difficult moment and still, somewhere, maintain a thread back to their own inner security. A thread that says, "This is hard and I will survive it, and there will be something on the other side." That thread is not a mood, it is something more durable, a knowledge held in the body more than in the mind, that they have been through difficult things before, and the difficult things did not finish them. Let your jaw soften. Mood is weather. Meaning is climate. The day you feel wonderful, the day you feel lost, both are weather. The underlying orientation toward life, the values that have organized your choices, the commitments that hold even when the mood does not cooperate, that is the climate. The climate can be good even in a day of rain. Frankl understood that for the sensitive person, this distinction is particularly important because the sensitive person's moods are particularly vivid. A difficult day is genuinely difficult. A low mood is genuinely low. If meaning waited for the weather to clear, the sensitive person would spend half their life in the waiting room. The finding of meaning in the midst of mood, not despite it, but in it, using it, is one of the most powerful things a person can learn. Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist who published Motivation and Personality in 1954 and developed his now famous hierarchy of needs, described what he called peak experiences, moments of extraordinary clarity and connection, moments when the person feels fully alive and fully themselves. He believed these experiences were a glimpse of what human beings are capable of at their best. But Maslow was careful to add something that is often forgotten. Peak experiences are not the same as meaning. They are evidence of it. They are moments when meaning becomes visible. Between those moments, meaning is still there, operating, organizing, choosing. It simply does not always announce itself. The sensitive person has more peak experiences than most. More moments when beauty arrives unexpectedly and something inside them opens completely. More moments of profound connection. More moments when the world seems to be speaking directly to them. And more difficult days. Maslow's B values, the being values that become available in moments of genuine health, were not abstractions to him. He collected accounts of peak experiences from hundreds of people over many years. He noticed that these experiences were disproportionately reported by people who had, as he phrased it, accepted their own nature, who had stopped fighting against who they were and had found a way to inhabit it. The sensitive person who has accepted their own sensitivity, who has stopped apologizing for it, stopped trying to calibrate it down, stopped offering the world a smaller version of themselves for the world's convenience. Such a person is positioned for the B values, for the aliveness that is not manufactured but emerges when the self is finally inhabited completely. This is not a project that completes in a night, but it begins in moments like this one. The room, the dark, the breath, the willingness to be here fully without managing what is felt. The B values arrive without announcement. They are already available. Both are the same sensitivity in different conditions. Tonight is not a difficult day. Tonight is simply night. And meaning, quiet, undramatic, climate rather than weather is here too. Chapter 12, Loneliness and Inner Calling. There is a kind of loneliness that is not loneliness at all. Frankl knew it. He had experienced it in the camps, in the years afterward, in the Vienna clinic, in the long quiets of a life that had seen enormous things. He described it in his writing not as absence but as presence, the presence of something interior that is so vivid, so alive, that the outer world cannot quite contain it. The person in the middle of this experience is not lonely in the social sense. They may be surrounded by people. They may be loved well. They may have friends who know them and a partner who sees them and children who need them. And still, somewhere inside them, there is a place that feels very quiet and very alone. Not because it lacks company, but because it is the place where they are most fully themselves, and no one else can quite go there with them. This is not a wound. It is the place from which meaning comes. Simone Weil, French philosopher, mystic, activist, born in Paris in 1909, dead at 34 of tuberculosis in 1943, wrote about attention as the highest form of love. Not the attention that demands and scrutinizes and judges, but the attention that simply receives, that makes itself fully available to what is there, that waits without agenda for what will arrive. Weil was often profoundly lonely. She was singular in a way that made ordinary social life feel insufficient. She was also, by the account of everyone who knew her, one of the most attentive people they had ever encountered. She could be with you in a way that felt like being fully seen. These two things, the loneliness and the attention, were not separable. The loneliness was the price of the depth. The depth was the source of the attention. Let your breath settle. Viktor Frankl wrote that conscience is the voice of meaning, calling the individual toward what they alone can do. Not humanity in general, not people who are similar to them. Them specifically, in their particular circumstances, with their particular history and capacities. This is an important idea. Meaning, in Frankl's framework, is not generic. It is not what makes a good life in the abstract. It is what makes your life specifically meaningful, given who you are and what the world right now needs from you. And finding that, locating the specific address of your particular meaning, requires a solitude that cannot be entirely shared. You have to go into that quiet place alone. The loneliness that the sensitive person feels, the loneliness that does not go away with company, that is there even in good relationships, that is not a complaint but a condition, is the loneliness of that inner room. The room where the calling lives. The room where you are most fully yourself. The room that no one else can quite enter because it is uniquely yours. Thomas Merton, the American Trappist monk and writer who lived in a small hermitage in the hills of Kentucky and wrote 7 books while there, including The 7-Story Mountain, which he published in 1948, understood solitude not as a deprivation, but as a fullness. He wrote that the person who is afraid of being alone is afraid of discovering who they are. And the person who is afraid of discovering who they are is afraid of the truth that their inner life contains. The sensitive person, by definition, is not afraid of their inner life. They live there. They are more accustomed to the inner landscape than to the outer one. They know its seasons and its weather, its dark corners and its sudden clearings. They have been living there for a long time, even when everyone around them has been urging them toward the outer world. Feel where you are heaviest right now. Martin Buber, the Austrian-Israeli philosopher who published I and Thou in 1923, a book about the quality of relationship, about what happens when two people truly encounter each other versus when they merely use each other, described the deep meeting between two people as the moment when each stops being an object in the other's world and becomes a genuine presence. An I meeting a thou, as he phrased it. Buber understood that this kind of meeting is rare, that most relationships operate at a lower register, efficient, friendly, functional, but not quite present. And he understood that the person who is most capable of this deep meeting is often also the most isolated, because they have experienced what real meeting feels like and cannot quite settle for less. The loneliness of the sensitive person is often the loneliness of someone who has tasted depth and cannot quite forget it. The inner calling that Frankl described has an important characteristic. It is not global. It does not announce itself as a grand destiny or a world historical mission. The calling that a person receives, the specific meaning that is theirs to fulfill, tends to be local, intimate, addressed to the specific life they are actually living, not to an idealized version of it. It sounds like this conversation matters. This relationship needs your full attention right now. This piece of work is asking something of you that you alone can give it. This person in front of you is waiting for something you have. Not heroic, particular. Buber's I-Thou meeting, the genuine encounter between two presences, almost always happens in the particular, in the specific room, the specific moment, the specific face. Not in the abstract, not in the general principle. The calling speaks there, in the specific room, which is to say, it has been speaking all along. The inner calling, the thing Frankl meant when he spoke of the voice of conscience, speaks from this place. It is not loud. It does not compete with the noise of the day. It waits quietly, in the room where you are most yourself, and it has been patient with you. You do not have to answer it tonight, but it is worth knowing it is there. Chapter 13. The courage to care. Now we can name the word. The word Frankl used, the word he reserved for the suffering that does not come from trauma or damage or biological illness, but from the collision between a deep inner life and a world that does not seem to need it, is neugenic neurosis. From nous, mind or spirit, and genic, arising from suffering, arising from the spirit's encounter with questions the spirit cannot avoid. He first used this term in clinical literature in the 1950s as he was developing logotherapy into a formal framework. He described noogenic neurosis as the suffering of a person who is, in some fundamental sense, too awake, too aware of the questions that organized existence poses, too unable to settle for surfaces when depths are available, too sensitive, in the precise sense, to the gap between the life being lived and the life that is possible. The neugenic sufferer is not sick in the classical sense. Their symptoms, anxiety, existential restlessness, the low-grade sorrow, the sense of incompletion, are not the symptoms of a damaged psyche. They are the symptoms of a healthy psyche in an insufficient environment, a spirit larger than the space it has been given. The cure is not to reduce the spirit, it is to enlarge the space. Let your jaw soften. Frankl was precise about what enlarging the space required. Not more stimulation, not more comfort, not the resolution of external problems, though those matter. It required what he called the courage to care, the willingness to invest genuinely without guarantee of return in something outside yourself, in work, in love, in a cause, in the building of something that will outlast you. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The person who has been hurt for caring, who has given fully and had the gift refused or damaged or lost, develops, over time, a reasonable caution about caring again. A reasonable hesitation at the edge of full investment. A voice that says, "You know what happened last time. You know how much it cost. Are you sure?" This is not weakness. This is wisdom of a kind. But Frankl would have added, it is incomplete wisdom, because the withdrawal from caring does not protect you from pain. It simply guarantees a different kind of pain, the pain of the unspent life. The pain of potential folded back on itself. The nogenic suffering of the spirit that has not found an adequate object for its depth. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. Søren Kierkegaard wrote about this with his characteristic intensity. He described the person who cannot commit as living in what he called the aesthetic stage, a life of sensation, variety, surface pleasure, infinite possibility, never landing anywhere. It looks like freedom. It feels eventually like a different kind of trap, because possibility without commitment is not freedom. It is suspension. The leap, Kierkegaard's phrase for the moment of genuine commitment, of landing somewhere and staying, is the moment that transforms possibility into reality. And it requires, by definition, leaving behind all the other possibilities. It requires the courage to care about this thing and not everything. For the sensitive person, the courage to care takes a very specific form. It is not the courage to feel they have always felt. It is the courage to let the feeling land somewhere, to let it become a commitment, to stop holding the depth at arm's length and let it meet the world. Frankl wrote, "For the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. The courage to care is the courage to stop asking what life means in general and to start asking what it means right now, in these specific circumstances, with these specific people, with this specific capacity for depth. The answer is never abstract. It is always in the room." Frankl had watched what happens to sensitive people when the neurogenic wound is not named, when the suffering has no address. When a person of great depth is told, kindly, by well-meaning others, that what they need is to think less, to worry less, to stop taking everything so seriously, to learn to relax. The advice is well-intentioned. It is also a category error. You do not treat the suffering of a person who is too awake with instructions to fall asleep. You treat it by giving the wakefulness somewhere to go. What Frankl found in his clinical practice across decades of work in Vienna is that many of his most neugenically distressed patients improved not when their anxiety was reduced, but when their engagement was increased. When they found, through what was often a slow and indirect process, a cause, a relationship, a creative project, a practice, something that felt genuinely worthy of their depth, not something that used them up, something that used them well. The courage to care, the willingness to invest in something real, with the full knowledge of what genuine investment costs, is not the absence of fear, it is the decision that the cost is worth it. That the alternative, the managed life, the calibrated engagement, the careful protection of oneself from the full weight of caring, costs more in the long run than the risk. Frankl never pretended this choice was easy. He simply believed it was the right one, and he had evidence. Feel the weight of your body. The night is here. The courage is already present in the fact that you have not stopped caring about the things that call to you. You have been doing this longer than you know. Chapter 14. Trauma and the Human Spirit. Adam kept a folder on his laptop for years called Emails Not Sent. He was a careful man, measured in his speech, thoughtful in his interactions, slow to anger and even slower to express it. But the careful exterior was maintained by an internal pressure valve, and the folder was the valve. When something hurt him, when someone dismissed him, or let him down, or crossed a line he had maintained in silence for too long, he would write the email. Everything in it, every injury, every unexpressed frustration, every quiet humiliation, absorbed and processed alone. Then he would save it and not send it. In 14 years, the folder contained 231 drafts. No one knew about the folder except Adam. He had not told his wife, his colleagues, his therapist of 6 years. The folder was the truest document of his interior life. The place where the full weight of what he felt, unedited, uncorrected, without the social filtering that had become his primary mode of operating, was allowed to exist. He was not unusual in this. Many sensitive people maintain a version of the folder, interior, invisible, the truest account of what they feel, kept carefully out of circulation because they have learned, over a long time, that the circulation of their fullness is too much for most rooms. Viktor Frankl would have recognized Adam's folder as a form of deferred dignity. The self that refuses to disappear even when it cannot speak. Let your breath settle. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score. Published in 2014 after decades of clinical work with traumatized patients at Massachusetts General Hospital and at Boston University, describes what trauma does to the relationship between a person and their own body. It disrupts the narrative. It breaks the story of the self. Before trauma, there is a coherent account of who you are, what you have done, what you value. After trauma, there is a gap, a break in the tape. But van der Kolk also describes something that Frankl had observed decades earlier from a different angle: the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Not resilience in the pop psychological sense, bouncing back, returning to baseline, but resilience in the deeper sense of the thread of self that persists through disruption. The capacity to remain recognizably yourself even after the story has been broken. The sensitive person's vulnerability to trauma is real. The nervous system that registers more also registers harm more completely. The wound goes deeper. The recovery takes longer. But the same nervous system that registers harm also registers beauty, also registers connection, also registers meaning. The depth of the wound and the depth of the resource are made of the same material. Feel where your body holds tension right now. Do not try to release it. Only notice. Dostoevsky stood in a courtyard in St. Petersburg on the 22nd of December 1849, facing a firing squad. He was 28 years old. He had been arrested for participating in a progressive literary circle. He had been in prison for 8 months. And now he stood in the December cold, the other prisoners beside him, the soldiers opposite, and the rifles raised. At the last moment, an aide-de-camp galloped into the courtyard with a sealed letter. The sentence was commuted. The rifles were lowered. Dostoevsky later wrote that in those seconds, the seconds between the rifles rising and the letter arriving, he had understood something he spent the rest of his life trying to articulate. Not a lesson about mortality exactly, something more intimate. That every moment of consciousness was a gift that he had been given without earning and could be withdrawn without warning. That the ordinary texture of life, the cold air, the faces of the other prisoners, the sound of a bird somewhere above the courtyard was extraordinary, had always been extraordinary. He had simply not been awake enough to notice. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground, in The Idiot, in The Brothers Karamazov. The theme runs through all of it. The person who has touched the edge of extinction and come back does not see the world the same way. Frankl had the same experience, extended over years. What Dostoevsky had in a courtyard for seconds, Frankl had in the camps for 3 years. And he came to the same conclusion, that the human spirit, confronted with its own fragility, does not only break, it also clarifies. Van der Kolk makes a distinction that Frankl would have recognized immediately. He writes about trauma survivors who have achieved what he calls narrative coherence, who can tell the story of what happened to them in a way that is organized, that has a beginning and a middle, and something that functions as a sense of direction, versus those who remain fragmented, for whom the story is still discontinuous, still interrupted by the body's responses, still unable to reach a perspective from which what happened can be held. The fragmented survivor suffers differently from the survivor with narrative coherence. Not necessarily more intensely. Fragmented experience is not worse by definition, but differently, without the thread. Frankl's contribution to this understanding is the sense-making layer above the narrative. Not only I can tell the story of what happened, but I can find in what happened something that allows me to continue moving forward, a meaning that is not a justification, but an orientation, a thread that leads somewhere. Adam's folder of unsent emails was the raw material of narrative, the account, kept carefully, of what the years had contained. When he read through it with the question not of grievance, but of understanding, what does all of this add up to? What kind of person has been keeping this record? The narrative coherence began to form. The thread appeared, and it led quietly forward. The trauma is real. The clarity is also real. Adam's folder contained 231 emails. He read through them one evening, not to send them, not to re-experience the injuries, but to understand what they added up to. What emerged from the reading was not the shape of the injuries, it was the shape of the self that had survived them. The consistent thread across all 231 drafts. A person who cared about honesty, who cared about being treated with respect, who cared about his relationships enough to feel the damage when they fell short. The folder was not a record of grievances. It was a record of someone who still cared. Chapter 15, Freedom Inside Feeling. Now we can name the second thing. The loneliness that is not loneliness. The one Frankl knew, the one that does not go away with company, has a name in the existential tradition. It is existential solitude. It is not social isolation. It is not depression. It is not the loneliness of someone who is unloved or unseen or neglected, though those are real and real enough. It is the fundamental condition of the individual, the fact that there is, at the deepest level, something irreducibly yours about your existence. You came into the world alone. You will leave it alone. And between those two facts, there is an interior life that cannot be fully transferred to another person, no matter how deep the love or how close the knowing. Albert Camus described this in The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, written in the middle of the German occupation of France. He called it the absurd, the gap between the human need for meaning, for clarity, for a reason, and the universe's absolute silence in response to that need. The absurd is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be faced. And the person who faces it honestly, who does not flee into religion or nihilism or distraction but simply holds the gap, that person has achieved a form of freedom that Camus believed was the deepest kind. Viktor Frankl disagreed with Camus on some things, but not on this. Let your jaw soften. The existential solitude that the sensitive person feels, the room inside them where they are most fully themselves, where no one quite follows, is not a failure of relationship. It is the condition of selfhood, the boundary of the individual, the place from which real love becomes possible, paradoxically, because you cannot truly give yourself to another person unless you have a self that is yours to give. Frankl wrote that the freedom that cannot be taken, the final human freedom, as he described it, is the freedom to choose one's attitude toward unavoidable circumstances. He arrived at this through the most extreme test imaginable. He was not offering comfort, he was reporting what he had seen. And what he had seen is this: that inside the most constrained external circumstances, inside the most complete deprivation of physical freedom, there remains an interior space, small sometimes, dark sometimes, but present. A space that is the individual's own, that belongs to no one else, that cannot be confiscated. Feel where you are right now. The room, the dark, the breath. This is that space. You are in it right now. The freedom inside feeling is not the absence of pain. It is not the resolution of anxiety. It is not the achievement of permanent calm or the elimination of the sensitive conscience or the quieting of the inner calling. It is something more basic and more durable. The knowledge that whatever you feel, you are not only what you feel, that you are the one who is having the feeling, that between you and the feeling there is a small but real distance, a witness, a chooser. Rollo May, writing in The Courage to Create in 1975, described creativity as the meeting of two worlds, the inner world of the individual and the outer world that exists independently of them. The creative act is the act of bringing what lives inside into relationship with what lives outside, of making the interior available to the world. The sensitive person does this constantly, with their attention, with their care, with their extraordinary capacity to register what is actually there and to respond to it completely. They are always, in this sense, in the act of creation. Frankl had a phrase for the attitude that makes this possible even in the darkest circumstances. He called it tragic optimism, not cheerfulness, not the pretense that things are better than they are, but the insistence, deliberate, chosen, renewed each day, that something is still possible, that the next moment could still be worth inhabiting, that the capacity to choose does not expire. Tragic optimism is the optimism of the sensitive person who has not looked away from anything and still gets up in the morning. It is not a small thing. It is, perhaps, the largest thing. Albert Camus described the person who faces the absurd honestly as a rebel. Not in the political sense. In the philosophical sense, someone who refuses to pretend, who refuses the false consolations. Who holds the gap between the human need for meaning and the universe's silence, and does not fill it with something convenient? The freedom inside feeling, the freedom Frankl described and Camus circled from a different angle, is not the freedom to feel differently than you do. It is the freedom to choose how you inhabit what you feel, to be the grief without becoming only the grief, to be the anxiety without becoming only the anxiety, to be the longing without waiting for the longing to resolve before you begin to live. This is harder than it sounds. The feelings are vivid. They fill the room. The sensitive person, in particular, knows how completely a feeling can occupy the interior, how a grief or a fear or a longing can arrive and seem to take up all the available space, leaving nowhere to stand outside it. Frankl's contribution is not the elimination of that fullness. It is the discovery of the witness inside it, the part of you that is observing the feeling rather than only experiencing it. Small sometimes, hard to find in the thick of the worst moments, but present. The witness does not intervene. It simply sees. And in the seeing, there is space enough for choice. The choice may be small, The choice may be only, I will continue to breathe. I will continue to be here. I will not disappear into this feeling entirely. But even that small choice is the freedom Frankl described. It is enough to rest in tonight. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Chapter 16. Turning Pain Toward Purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, author of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Twilight of the Idols, writing in the late 19th century from a succession of rented rooms across Europe, often in severe physical pain from the migraines and eye problems that afflicted him, wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Viktor Frankl quoted this line in Man's Search for Meaning. He quoted it because he had watched it prove true. In the camps, he had observed that the prisoners who maintained the clearest connection to a purpose, a person who was waiting for them, a work that was unfinished, a task they believed only they could complete, these prisoners bore what was objectively unbearable, with a resilience that astonished him. The why was not a guarantee of survival. People with strong purposes died too. The camps were not a meritocracy of meaning, but the why changed something interior. It changed the relationship between the person and their suffering, made the suffering an obstacle rather than a verdict, made it something to endure rather than something that had already won. Turning pain toward purpose is not a technique, it is a philosophy. It is the understanding that pain in itself proves nothing about the final worth of a life. Pain is simply what certain kinds of experience feel like. It is information, sometimes. It is the body or the spirit telling you something. But it is not a conclusion. Feel your breath moving in and out. Frankl was careful, always careful about this. He did not say that suffering has meaning. He did not say that everything happens for a reason. He had too much respect for the people who had died meaninglessly in the camps to offer that consolation. What he said was more precise. That meaning is possible even in suffering. That a person can find inside the unavoidable difficulty of their circumstances something toward which to orient themselves, something that makes continuing worthwhile. This is not the same as saying suffering is secretly good. It is saying that the person is capable of more than the suffering implies. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, the love of fate, developed across several works, but named clearly in The Gay Science of 1882, goes one step further than Frankl. Where Frankl says meaning can be found in suffering, Nietzsche says that the spiritually mature person moves toward something stranger, the affirmation of everything that has happened, not as something that should have happened, not as something good, but as something that is now irrevocably part of what you are. The acceptance of the total fact of your life, including its worst parts. This is not for everyone. This is not for every night. But it is worth knowing that people have gotten there. Let your jaw soften. The sensitive person turns pain toward purpose not through heroic acts, but through small, daily choices. through the decision to notice what the pain is teaching rather than only how much it hurts, through the practice of asking, not in the midst of acute suffering, but in the quieter moments after, what this experience has made them understand that they did not understand before. Frankl described 3 ways that meaning becomes available through suffering. The first, the suffering itself changes nothing in the outer world, but something in the inner one. The person who bears it with dignity becomes, through the bearing, more fully themselves. The second, the suffering reveals something about what the person values, about what they cannot abandon even when everything else falls away. The third, and this is the one that matters most in the long run, the suffering survived, becomes the material from which a person can genuinely help others. Not the performance of help, not the advice of someone who has read about difficulty, the presence of someone who has been there. The person who has suffered and found a way through is not the same as the person who has never suffered. They have something the second person does not, a certain quality of knowledge that only the interior route delivers, a certain kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of experience, but from the survival of it. Ethan Kross, an American psychologist at the University of Michigan, who published Chatter in 2021, a study of the voice inside the human head, how it helps and how it harms, found that one of the most effective ways to manage the inner critic, the voice that loops and accuses and catastrophizes, is to address yourself by name, to step into a slightly distanced perspective. Not what should I do, but what should your name do? The distance is small, the effect is not. It creates enough separation between the self and the suffering to allow for choice. The practical reality of turning pain toward purpose looks, most of the time, nothing like a revelation. It looks like the morning after a difficult night when you choose to get up and do the thing you said you would do. It looks like the conversation you finish even though it is hard. It looks like the email you send, finally, after the folder of drafts. It looks like the question you ask someone, genuinely, because you know from your own experience what it costs not to be asked. These are not dramatic acts. They are the texture of a purpose-oriented life, the daily accumulation of small choices made in the direction of what matters. Frankl wrote that the meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man or his own psyche. It is outside, in engagement, in the things we turn toward, not inside as a static possession. The pain gives you the sensitivity to notice what is there. The purpose gives you the direction in which to move toward it. The combination is what it looks like to be fully alive. Frankl had understood this instinctively. In the worst circumstances, he had practiced a kind of internal self-address, imagining himself, years later, in a warm lecture hall, teaching what the camps were teaching him. Not denying the present, holding it while also holding its meaning. The pain is the raw material, the purpose is the direction, and the person choosing is the one who turns one into the other. Chapter 17. Love as Recognition. Martin Buber, the Austrian-Israeli philosopher who published I and Thou in 1923, the year he was 45, the year after he had moved from Leipzig to Frankfurt, the year he was already beginning to work on the dense, luminous theology of relationship that would define his life's work, wrote that love is not a feeling. He meant this carefully. A feeling, Buber said, accompanies love and appears within it, and sometimes signals its presence. But love itself is something more active. It is a mode of relation, a way of meeting, the capacity to turn toward another person, not as an object, not as someone who has a role in your life, a function, a use, but as a genuine presence, as someone who is irreducibly themselves, whose existence is real and not a backdrop to your own. He called this the I-thou relationship, in contrast to the I-it relationship that characterizes most of our interactions with the world and often with each other. Viktor Frankl had a simpler word for the same thing. He called it love. And he wrote, in Man's Search for Meaning, in a passage that comes directly from his experience in the camps, from a morning march in the dark and the cold, thinking about his wife, not knowing she was already dead, he wrote that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of their personality. No one else can grasp you there. No achievement reaches there. No reputation. No success. Only love. Let your breath settle. The sensitive person tends toward Buber's I-thou mode naturally. They do not always choose it. Sometimes the overwhelm of full presence is too much, and they manage from a slight distance, but it is their native register, the mode in which they are most themselves. When a sensitive person loves, they love completely. They attend to the person to who they actually are, not who they are supposed to be, not the version that is convenient or legible or easy. They notice what others miss. They remember the small thing that was said in passing 3 months ago. They track the subtle changes in mood, in energy, in the way someone holds themselves. They love the full person, including the parts the person has not quite accepted about themselves. This is a profound gift. It is also exhausting, and it is sometimes the source of a particular kind of grief. The grief of loving someone who does not love themselves as clearly as you can see them. The grief of seeing what someone is capable of and watching them choose smaller than that. The grief of knowing completely a person who does not quite know themselves. Feel where your body is heaviest right now. Frankl's insight about love is not sentimental. It is clinical in the best sense, precise, based on observation, stripped of anything wishful. He observed that love was not a luxury. It was not the reward for having achieved other things. It was, in his framework, one of the 3 primary pathways into meaning, alongside creative work and the attitude toward unavoidable suffering. To be loved is to be seen. To be seen is to know that your existence has registered somewhere, in someone, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only you can register. It is one of the few experiences that makes the existential solitude, the fundamental aloneness of the individual, bearable. Not solved, bearable. The solitude remains. But inside it, there is a held quality, a warmth. Frankl thought of his wife during the death marches and the morning work details. He had conversations with her in his mind. He asked her questions and received answers that he knew came from his own imagination and also trusted completely. The love was real. The love was present. The love made meaning available in a place where very little else did. The sensitive person who loves with full attention, who loves the person as they actually are, is doing something Buber and Frankl both recognized as among the highest human capacities. They are making another person real. Not real in the mechanical sense, real in the sense that matters witnessed, held in another's awareness, known. There is no equivalent technology. There is something specific about love, as Frankl described it, in the camps that deserves attention here. He was walking on a pre-dawn work detail. It was cold. The work was brutal, and the future was uncertain, and his body was already beginning to show the signs of the malnutrition that would have killed him if the liberation had not come when it did. And he found himself in that state, thinking about his wife. Not about finding her, not about the practical question of whether she was alive. He did not know. He chose in that moment not to dwell on the not knowing. He thought instead about her face. The particular quality of her attention when she looked at him, the way she moved in their apartment on the Alserstrasse. Small things, specific things. Things that no one else had ever noticed about her and that he had been collecting quietly across the years of their marriage without knowing he was collecting them. He wrote later that in that moment he understood something that he had previously only known abstractly, that love is the only way to apprehend another person in the full reality of who they are, that the mind, left to its own devices, deals in types and categories. Love deals in this specific person, this particular face, this irreplaceable way of being in the world. The sensitive person loves this way naturally. It is their gift, and it does not require much. It requires only the willingness to look fully, without agenda, without the filter of what you wish the person were, and to let what you see actually land. Chapter 18. The inner critic softened. The voice in your head that says it is not enough is not yours. It was given to you, probably early, probably by someone who was themselves operating under similar pressures, who passed along the standard they had been given without quite examining it. The voice arrived before you could evaluate it, before you had the vocabulary to say, wait, whose standard is this? Is this actually what I believe? Is this measurement I keep failing actually one I would choose? And by the time you had the vocabulary, the voice had been with you so long it felt like your own. Viktor Frankl observed that many of the patients who came to him were not suffering from guilt about things they had actually done wrong. They were suffering from a chronic, low-level self-accusation that had no specific object. An inner critic that was not responding to evidence but had become a habit. A voice that said, "Not enough," regardless of what they achieved, or gave, or built, or changed. He understood this as a form of existential noise. Not the voice of the conscience, which points and calls and leads somewhere specific, but the voice of a borrowed standard that had outlived its usefulness. The difference matters. The conscience says, "Here is what matters to you. Here is where you have fallen short. Here is the direction." The inner critic says, "You are not enough." Full stop. No direction, no invitation, just verdict. One of them is useful. Let your jaw soften. Donald Winnicott, working with mothers and infants and troubled adults in London in the 1950s and 1960s, described what he called the impingement, the external demand that arrives on the developing self before the self is equipped to handle it. The impingement interrupts the natural unfolding of the true self. The child, to survive the interruption, develops a false self, a managed version, a self that can operate in the environment as it is rather than as the child needs it to be. The inner critic in many people is the voice of the false self maintaining its vigilance, still ensuring that the true self does not show itself too much, does not need too much, does not feel too much, does not embarrass anyone. It has been working hard for a long time, but it is not your voice. Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan, studying the chatter of the inner critic across years of research, found something interesting. The content of the inner critic matters less than many people think. The volume is more harmful than the message. The relentless quality, the looping, the return after you thought it had passed, the arrival at 2 a.m. when you cannot do anything about whatever it is accusing you of. That is what does the damage. One of Kross's findings was that naming the inner critic, treating it as a distinct voice rather than as your own voice, addressing it from a slight distance, reduces its power significantly. Not by arguing with it, not by defeating it with evidence that you are in fact enough, simply by recognizing it as a voice, not as you. Thomas Merton, writing in his hermitage in Kentucky in the 1960s, had an older word for this. He called it the false self, and wrote that the spiritual work of a lifetime is the patient dismantling of it. Not the violent rejection of it that only strengthens it, but the gentle, repeated choice to return to what is actually true about you, what you actually value, what you actually feel. The self beneath the performance. The false self, Merton wrote, is not bad. It is trying to protect you. It developed because it needed to develop. The question is whether it is still necessary now, in this room, at this hour, when no one is watching and nothing is required. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The softening of the inner critic is not a project that completes. It is a practice of noticing. The voice arrives, you hear it, you note. This is the borrowed standard. This is the voice that was given to me before I could choose. And then you ask quietly, is there anything here I actually want to hear. Sometimes there is. Sometimes the inner critic, beneath its harshness, contains a real signal, a genuine recognition that something matters to you and is not getting the attention it deserves. The sensitive conscience underneath the noisy critic. The softening of the inner critic is not a one-time event. This matters to say clearly. The voice returns. Sometimes it returns with the same accusations, sometimes it finds new material. Sometimes it arrives most loudly in the moments just before sleep, when the day's protections have come down and the noise of activity has quieted and there is nothing between you and whatever the voice wants to say. When it arrives tonight, you can notice it without agreeing with it. You can note this is a voice. It is not the voice of my conscience which leads somewhere. It is the voice of a borrowed standard which only circles. You can let it speak, and then you can turn your attention to something more real. The weight of your body, the breath moving, the room around you in the dark. The voice is not the enemy, it is only a habit. And habits, noted enough times, lose their automaticity. This is enough to do tonight. Notice, return, notice, return. Strip away the harshness and listen for that. The rest, the verdict, the not enough, the comparison to an impossible standard, that can rest tonight. It does not have to work while you sleep. Chapter 19. Sensitivity as responsibility. Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist who spent most of his career at Brandeis University in Massachusetts, and who published his foundational work, Motivation and Personality, in 1954, believed that the highest human development was not the absence of need, but the fullness of engagement. What he called self-actualization, not perfection, not the elimination of struggle, but the full deployment of what a person is capable of in service of something beyond themselves. He spent the last years of his life, before his death in 1970, revising his hierarchy of needs. He had become convinced that it was incomplete. He added a level beyond self-actualization. He called it self-transcendence, the movement beyond the self entirely, into service, into contribution, into the kind of engagement with life that is no longer primarily about what you receive from it, but about what you give. Viktor Frankl had been living this revision since before Maslow wrote it. Frankl's entire post-camp career was built on a simple conviction that the meaning he had found in the camps belonged not to him, but to the people who could use it. That his survival was not for his benefit, but for the benefit of those he had not yet met. That the work of writing and teaching and building logotherapy was not personal achievement, but personal responsibility. Sensitivity as responsibility is the understanding that depth is not a private possession, that the capacity to feel more, to register more, to carry more, creates an obligation, not a burden, an invitation. Let your breath settle. The sensitive person has been told their whole life that their depth is too much, too intense, too overwhelming for ordinary rooms. They have learned to manage it, to calibrate it, to distribute only the portion that fits. What Frankl and Maslow together suggest is that this management while sometimes socially necessary, is not the final answer. The final answer is to find the room that is large enough, the work that is demanding enough, the relationship that is honest enough, the life that is organized around the depth rather than in spite of it. This does not always look dramatic. It rarely does. It looks like the nurse who absorbs what the patient cannot bear and carries it home and processes it alone and returns the next day. It looks like the teacher who remembers that the student who is struggling is a person, not a problem, and finds the extra hour. It looks like the person who listens, really listens, with the full attention of someone who understands from the inside what it costs to speak when everyone else is too busy. Feel where your body is heaviest right now. Simone Weil wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She meant it precisely. To attend to another person fully, without agenda, without the management of your own reaction, is to give them something that cannot be bought or faked. It can only be given by someone who is actually present. The sensitive person is constitutionally capable of this. The responsibility is to offer it, not to everyone, not at all times, that way lies depletion and resentment, but to the people and the work and the moments where it is actually called for, where the depth is actually what is needed. Frankl believed that every person has a unique responsibility, a task that only they can fulfill given their particular combination of history and capacity and position in the world. He did not mean this in a grandiose way, he meant it quietly, that the conversation you are able to have because of what you have lived is a conversation no one else can quite have in the same way. That the care you are able to offer because of what you carry is care no one else can offer in the same way. The sensitive person's depth is not their private property. It is something they hold in trust for the moments, the people, the work that need exactly that. The responsibility does not mean you must give everything. Frankl was not asking for martyrdom. He was describing something more sustainable and more honest, a life in which the depth you carry is recognized as something that has uses beyond yourself. Something that, directed well, creates conditions that other people need. The sensitive person who has hidden their depth, who has learned to pass as someone who feels less, who has constructed a more manageable exterior for the world's convenience, is not doing the world a favor. They are protecting the world from something the world needs. Not all of it, not all the time, not in every room, but in the right rooms, with the right people, at the right moments. The full depth, offered honestly, is not too much. It is exactly enough. Simone Weil wrote that the desire to love and the desire to be loved both require a kind of courage. The courage to be seen as you actually are. The courage to offer what you actually have rather than the managed version. The courage to let the other person decide whether the depth is something they can receive. Many sensitive people have never given anyone that chance. They have pre-decided on the other person's behalf that the depth would be unwelcome, that the room would not hold it, that the relationship could not sustain it. Sometimes they have been right, but not always. The responsibility of depth includes the responsibility to find out. Chapter 20: Depression and Lost Meaning. There is a difference between depression and the loss of meaning that matters, and that the clinical vocabulary does not always make easy to see. Frankl was careful about this distinction. He had enormous respect for biological psychiatry. He understood that there were forms of depression rooted in neurological and chemical realities that required pharmacological treatment. He did not dismiss this, he supported it. But he had also observed something else, a form of suffering that presented similarly to depression, that was quiet and heavy and pervasive, that drained the color from daily life. But that did not arise from a chemical imbalance. That arose from a person's loss of connection to what they most deeply valued, from the experience of living day after day in a way that did not correspond to what mattered most to them. He called this existential depression, and he treated it differently. The existential treatment was not the modification of mood, it was the recovery of meaning. The gradual reorientation of the person towards something outside themselves that could claim their attention and their care and their investment, not a distraction, a genuine call. Let your jaw soften. The sensitive person is particularly vulnerable to this form of suffering because they feel the correspondence between their inner life and their outer life acutely. When the two are aligned, when the work they do each day is work they believe in, when the relationships they inhabit are ones where they are genuinely known, when the values they hold are actually expressed in the shape of their life, they are not happy exactly, but they are alive in a particular way, present, real. When the correspondence breaks down, when the work becomes hollow, when the relationships thin out, when the life they are living diverges from the life they most deeply want, they do not simply feel disappointed, they feel the full weight of the divergence, and it is heavy. Irvin Yalom, who has spent more than 50 years as a therapist, describes this in his work as the confrontation with the ultimate concerns: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. The person who can sit with these concerns, who can acknowledge them without being destroyed, has achieved a kind of equanimity that is not comfortable but is real. The person who cannot quite sit with them finds that they leak, that the anxiety about meaninglessness shows up as irritability, or perfectionism, or the inability to sleep, or the low-grade sorrow that arrived without a clear event and won't leave. Feel where your breath is in your body right now. William James, who suffered severe depression himself as a young man, who wrote in 1870, at the age of 28, about a crisis in which he could not see any reason to continue, and who slowly, deliberately, built his way back through philosophical work and the decision to act as if his own freedom was real. James understood depression as a crisis of meaning before it was a crisis of mood. He did not have Frankl's vocabulary, but he had the experience. And what he wrote across many years and many books is that the recovery from depression of this kind requires not primarily the modification of mood, but the recovery of agency, the sense that your choices matter, that what you do today is genuinely connected to what you will become, that you are not simply being swept along by forces you cannot influence. This is, in Frankl's terms, the recovery of the will to meaning. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives in small moments. The morning that does not feel entirely pointless. The conversation that is genuine. The hour of work where something flows. The small, quiet sense that this day, with its ordinary difficulties and its ordinary small satisfactions, is worth inhabiting. The depression that comes from lost meaning is not healed by finding a grand purpose. It is healed mostly by finding small ones. The next thing that actually matters. The next moment of genuine engagement. The next step that is actually yours. Frankl said it simply, meaning is found, not manufactured, and often it is found in the smallest things. The light through the window, the sound of someone breathing beside you, the weight of your own body, held by the world at the end of a difficult day. The path back from existential depression is rarely linear. Frankl understood this from his clinical work and from his own experience. The meaning does not arrive in a single clear moment. It arrives in fragments, in small openings, in mornings that are slightly less heavy than the morning before, in conversations that are slightly more genuine, in the hour of work that engages something real. The sensitive person who feels everything completely tends to feel the absence of meaning completely as well. The depression is not mild. The sense of emptiness, when it arrives, is total. And the expectation, conscious or not, is that the recovery will also be total. That meaning, when it returns, will return in a form that matches the fullness of what was lost. It does not work that way. Meaning returns small, in the specific detail, in the tree at the window, in the conversation that is genuine for 20 minutes, in the work that flows for 1 hour out of 8, in the person you were genuinely glad to see. Frankl called these provisional meanings, small meanings that do not resolve the large question but make the next step possible. They are not the answer. They are the evidence that the answer is still possible. That the capacity for meaning has not been permanently extinguished. That it is still there, waiting in smaller and quieter forms until the larger forms become possible again. Notice what is small and real in your life right now. Not the large questions, the small and real things. They are still there. Chapter 21, Restlessness of the Soul. Now we can say it. The moment in the ordinary room. The moment Frankl returned to across many years, across many books, not as a dramatic scene but as a quiet one. The kind of moment that does not shout its significance but carries it in a way that lasts. He was at a window. The year was sometime in the 1960s. After the camps, after the years of rebuilding, after the books and the international lectures and the establishment of logotherapy as a recognized clinical school. He was in his office in Vienna, the office he had occupied for years. And outside the window, there was a tree. An ordinary tree. Not young, not remarkable. An ordinary European tree, early spring, the first leaves beginning. And Frankl stood at the window and looked at the tree and felt, without warning, and without particular cause, grateful. Not for anything specific, not for the recovery from the camps, which was real, not for the work, which was meaningful, not for his wife Ellie, who had come into his life after the war and whom he loved, not for any of these things in particular, simply grateful for the tree, for the window, for the fact of consciousness, of being the kind of thing that can look at a tree in early spring and register that the tree is there and that it is remarkable. This is what he had been trying to describe all along. Let your breath settle. The restlessness of the soul is the condition that Frankl spent his career trying to name, not an illness, not a character flaw. The simple fact that the human spirit, particularly the sensitive human spirit, is larger than any single answer can satisfy, is always reaching past the last thing it understood toward the next, is never fully at rest, and this is not a problem. Pascal had written it in the 17th century. The heart is restless. Augustine had written it in the 4th. Our heart is restless until it rests in thee, which is the religious answer, and one that many people find sufficient. But the secular version of the observation is the same. The human spirit is built with an appetite that exceeds any finite satisfaction. The sensitive person knows this intimately. They have chased many things that they thought would finally settle the restlessness. The achievement, the relationship, the understanding, the recognition. And each thing, when it arrived, was real and often good. And the restlessness remained. This is not failure. This is the structure of the human soul. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. Frankl wrote about what he called supra-meaning, a meaning that lies beyond what any person can fully grasp. The religious person locates it in God. The secular person locates it in the human story itself, in the long, improbable, remarkable fact of consciousness arising in the universe and asking questions about itself. In the tree, at the window, in early spring, being looked at by someone who finds it remarkable. The restlessness of the soul is not an error in the design, it is the design. The human being who has no unrealized potential, no question that has not yet been answered, no longing that has not yet found its object. That being is not at peace. That being has stopped. The restlessness is evidence that you have not stopped, that you are still here, still reaching, still carrying the questions that do not yet have answers, which is another way of saying still alive to the possibilities. Frankl stood at the window in Vienna in the 1960s in a life that had survived things that should not have been survivable, and looked at a tree beginning to leaf and felt grateful without an object for the gratitude. That moment is not the answer to the restlessness. It is what the restlessness was always pointing toward. The capacity to be present to the ordinary and find it remarkable. Let that be enough tonight. The restlessness is not a problem that will eventually be solved and set down. Frankl had lived long enough to know this. He had survived the camps and rebuilt his life and written the books and traveled the world and maintained his clinical practice into his late 80s. He had more resolution of the major questions than most people will ever have. And still, he has described the restlessness as a permanent feature of a life lived honestly. The questions change. The depth of the answers increases. But the reaching does not stop. The spirit does not arrive at a final destination and stay. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a description of what it means to be alive. The tree at the window was not an answer to any of Frankl's questions. It was a moment of full presence that did not require a question to be valuable. The gratitude he felt was not for having solved anything. It was for being the kind of being that can look at a tree and find it remarkable. The restlessness, properly understood, is the engine of that capacity. The same reach that produces the existential discomfort also produces the ability to be fully present when presence is available. The same depth that makes the dark difficult makes the light vivid. You cannot separate them, and so the restlessness is not something to cure. It is something to understand, to work with, to give direction, as Frankl gave it direction, so that the reaching becomes an orientation rather than only an affliction. Let your breath settle. The restlessness is here, quieter now. It will be here tomorrow, calling you toward what you have not yet become. That is not a burden tonight. Tonight, it is simply the sound of being alive. Chapter 22, The Quiet Will to Meaning. The will to meaning is not the will to happiness. Frankl distinguished these carefully. He had watched people in the camps who focused on their own survival, who organized their energy entirely around staying alive, around securing food and warmth, and avoiding the worst of the violence. Some of them survived, and some of them, having survived, found themselves in the strange position of having accomplished what they fought for and feeling nevertheless empty. The survival was not enough by itself. It needed to be survival for something. The will to meaning is quieter than the will to power and less immediately gratifying than the will to pleasure. It does not produce the rush of achievement or the warmth of satisfaction in the ordinary sense. It produces something harder to name and more durable, the sense that you are living in accord with what you most deeply value, that the shape of your days is not accidental but chosen, that you are answering slowly, imperfectly, with many revisions, the call that your own depth has been making for as long as you can remember. Let your jaw soften. The sensitive person often already knows what they most deeply value. They have known it since childhood, though they may not have had the language for it. They have felt it as a pull toward certain kinds of work, certain kinds of conversation, certain kinds of experience. They have felt it as an absence when it is not there. They have organized their life, consciously or not, around its gravity. The question is not, what do you value? You know that. The question is whether the life you are living reflects it. Frankl's logotherapy is not finally, a system of thought. It is a practice of interrogation, a daily asking of, what does this moment ask of me? What is here in front of me that I alone am in a position to respond to? Not because I am special, but because I am here, and this is now, and no one else has exactly my combination of history and capacity and presence in this room. That question, asked honestly, answered honestly, is the will to meaning in practice. Feel where your body is heavy right now. Let the heaviness tell you something about what you have been carrying. Kierkegaard wrote about the self as a task, not the self as a given, as a thing you already are, fully formed and fixed. The self as something you are always in the process of becoming. The task of a life is not to discover who you already are, that is the simpler version, but to build who you are still becoming. The sensitive person who has spent years managing their depth, calibrating their output, making themselves smaller in order to fit, that person has work to do. Not the dramatic work of transformation, the ordinary work of returning. Returning to the values they have always held. Returning to the questions that have always called to them. Returning to the size they actually are, which is larger than they have been permitted to inhabit. The will to meaning is the will to return. Frankl never promised that this returning would be easy, or that it would arrive all at once, or that it would finally silence the restlessness. He promised something more honest, that it was worth doing, that the person who organizes their life around their deepest values, imperfectly and with much revision, is living more fully than the person who does not. That the depth, honored, becomes a home rather than a burden. That you can live inside what you feel rather than in spite of it. That the soul's restlessness, given direction, becomes the engine rather than the affliction. That is enough. The will to meaning is patient. It does not require you to have found it completely before it continues to operate. It does not expire in the difficult years, the low seasons, the stretches when the direction is obscured and the days are simply days, and nothing calls particularly loudly. Frankl observed in his patients and in himself that the will to meaning sometimes works underground, that even in the periods of greatest confusion, the person is being organized by something they cannot yet name, making choices that seem arbitrary and will only make sense in retrospect. Moving toward people, toward experiences, toward questions that are preparing the ground for something that has not yet arrived. This is the faith that is available to the secular mind. Not faith in an outcome, but faith in the process. The belief that the reaching, maintained honestly, leads somewhere. That the depth, inhabited rather than managed, eventually finds its worthy object. Kierkegaard wrote about a concept he called repetition, not repetition in the ordinary sense, but a kind of return that brings the person back to themselves at a deeper level. The person who has wandered away from their own center and found their way back is not at the same place they started. They are at the same place, but knowing it for the first time, carrying it now with the knowledge of what its absence cost. The will to meaning, returning after a difficult period, has this quality. Not the same as before, deeper, more honest, more grateful for the thread. Let that be enough tonight. Chapter 23. Emotional healing through purpose. The healing that Frankl described was not the healing of damage. He was precise about this. He had seen too much to use the word healing carelessly. Some damage is real and irreversible. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some wounds are permanent. But what he had also seen, in the camps, in the clinic, in the extraordinary variety of human experience he had witnessed across a career that spanned 6 decades, is that the permanent wound and the continuing life are not mutually exclusive. That a person can carry something that will never fully heal and still find themselves moving towards something, still find themselves capable of beauty and connection and purpose. The healing is not the closing of the wound. The healing is the finding of a direction in which to move with the wound as a companion. Purpose does not erase pain. It gives pain an address. Let your breath settle. The sensitive person who has suffered, and most sensitive people have suffered more than they have admitted, because the admission itself requires more than the ordinary emotional vocabulary allows, carries something that could either consume them or become the source of their deepest capacity for good. Frankl would have said, both are possible. The direction is chosen, not easily, not once, not without return visits to the darkest material and the hardest questions. The choosing is a practice, not an event. A returning again and again to the orientation toward meaning rather than the orientation toward pain. Bessel van der Kolk, in his clinical work with traumatized patients, observed something that took him years to fully understand, that the healing of trauma is not primarily a cognitive process. The story of what happened is important, and the therapy of telling it is important, but the healing happens in the body, in the slow return to safety, in the gradual relearning that it is possible to be present in the physical world without the body registering it as threat. The sensitive person's healing is similar. It is not primarily about understanding more. They already understand a great deal. It is about returning to the body, to the breath, to the simple physical fact of being alive, in this room, at this hour, with the night around them and the day behind them. Feel the weight of your body right now. Abraham Maslow, in his later work, wrote about what he called the be values, the being values, the qualities of experience that appear in moments of genuine health and full engagement. Beauty, truth, wholeness, justice, aliveness, perfection, in the sense of things being fully what they are. These were not abstract ideals for Maslow. They were descriptions of what became available when a person was living in accord with their deepest nature. The sensitive person has access to these moments, has probably had them, moments of extraordinary presence, of the world seeming to be exactly itself, of feeling fully awake in a way that ordinary life does not consistently permit. Frankl's window and the tree. Dostoevsky in the courtyard. The bird noticed for the first time. These moments are the compass, not the destination. No moment can be held permanently, but the compass, the indication of the direction in which aliveness lives for you, specifically given who you are and what you have been and what you are still becoming. Emotional healing through purpose is the gradual alignment of daily life with the compass. Not perfectly, not without error, with many diversions and returns and periods of forgetting followed by periods of remembering, but directional, oriented. The wound does not close, but you move. And the moving, maintained across time, across ordinary days with their ordinary difficulties and their small ordinary openings to something real, the moving is what healing looks like from the inside. Not arrival, direction. The healing that Frankl described does not require you to have become someone different from who you are. It does not require the conversion of your sensitivity into something more manageable. It does not require you to stop feeling things completely, to stop carrying what you carry, to stop being the person who notices too much and cannot quite pretend otherwise. It requires only the direction. The person who moves toward meaning, even slowly, even with much distraction and many returns to the difficult material, is healing. Not despite the sensitivity. Through it, the sensitivity is the instrument of the healing, because it is the instrument of the noticing, and the noticing is where everything begins. Bessel van der Kolk, after decades of work with trauma, arrived at something that sounds simple and is not. That the body heals in safety, not the absence of all risk. Safety in the sense of the nervous system settling enough to allow for the return of presence, for the world to begin to feel again like a place where it is possible to be. This room, right now, is safe enough. The breath moving in your body is real and present. The weight of your body against the mattress is real and present. Whatever you have been carrying today, the grief, the worry, the question without an answer, the longing that has not yet found its address, it does not have to be carried right now. The healing continues in sleep. The direction continues in the body's rest. The tree will be there in the morning, and the window and the light. Chapter 24. A gentle return to peace. The room was there before you arrived. It will be here after you leave. The walls, the dark, the small sounds of a house settling, these have nothing to do with what you have been carrying today, and they will remain steady and indifferent in the best sense. Long after the day's weight has dissolved into sleep, you came to this room tonight carrying whatever you carry. The things with names and the things without. The grief that has an object and the grief that is simply there. The wanting that has never quite found its address. The questions you have been asking for years that have not yet provided their answers. Viktor Frankl understood all of that. He spent his life in the company of it. And he would have said, gently, from the particular authority of a person who has seen the worst and come back, that you are not required to resolve it tonight, that the resolution, when it comes, will come in the middle of living, in the small daily choices, in the returning again and again to what actually matters to you. In the moments when the tree appears outside the window and something in you, without warning, finds it remarkable. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body against what is beneath you, the mattress holding you, gravity doing its simple ancient work. You do not have to hold yourself up right now. The world has you. Across these hours, we have moved through what Frankl understood about the sensitive soul, the depth that is not a flaw but an orientation, the anxiety that is not a disorder but a guide, the loneliness that is not loneliness but the interior room where you are most fully yourself, the inner critic that is not your voice but a borrowed one, the will to meaning that asks not what life means in general, but what it means right now, in these circumstances, given who you are. We have moved through what he discovered in the worst place imaginable and brought back that the final human freedom, the one that cannot be confiscated, is the freedom to choose how you relate to what you cannot change. Not the absence of pain, the presence of choice inside it. The sensitive person knows this, even if they have not named it. They have been practicing it all along. Feel the breath moving in your body. Let it move at its own pace. Simone Weil wrote that the purest form of attention is love. The quietest form of love is simply being present to what is there. Not fixing it, not solving it, being there with it. You are being present right now to the night, to the dark, to the weight of your body and the small sounds of the house, to the particular quality of this particular evening at the end of this particular day of your particular life. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The day is behind you. The morning is ahead. Between them, you have this: the dark, the breath, the weight, the quiet. Frankl spent years after the camps believing that his survival was not for himself alone, that the meaning he had found in suffering was something he owed to others. He gave it in books, in lectures, in the clinical practice he maintained until he was well into his 80s, in the personal letters he answered by hand until the end. He gave it because he believed that what one person has learned from the interior route cannot be substituted by anything else, cannot be downloaded or abbreviated or replaced. It has to be carried by a person. You are a person who carries things. That depth you have, the depth that has sometimes exhausted you, that has made you feel out of step with the pace of the ordinary world, that has made the night louder and the questions larger and the losses more complete, that depth is not your problem. It is your most essential quality. And tonight, it gets to rest. The questions will be there tomorrow. The calling will be there tomorrow. The work of finding your particular meaning in your particular life, that continues. But tonight, the dark, the breath, the weight of your body held by the world. You have been paying attention all your life. You are allowed to stop now for a few hours. The tree will still be there in the morning. One more thing. The sensitivity that has felt for much of your life like something to manage, the depth that has seemed too large for ordinary rooms, was always the right size. The rooms were just too small. Find the larger rooms. Sleep now.